Welcome to AUSA's Army Matters podcast, focusing on what's important to the total Army community. We bring vital Army conversations and interviews on issues relevant to soldiers, military families, and all of you amazing Army supporters. Rotating each week, our show includes Soldier Today, Leading Great Teams, Family Voices, and Thought Leaders. Let's tune into the show.
The silence was unnerving after several days at sea, crossing from America with the constant grinding of the ship's engines. Quiet now in the Atlantic waters off North Africa, but it didn't last long. In the early hours, bells clanged and then soldiers heard an anchor's chains rattle, barked orders, heavy and frantic footsteps, power winches whirring as they started to lower landing craft into the white-capped water.
My fellow Americans, the Navy Department of the United States...
24-year-old Lieutenant Maurice Footsie Brit, to his surprise, heard the voice of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, announced the invasion of North Africa had already begun. Brit figured they had jumped the gun a little. They were still 8 miles from shore. The blonde-haired Brit, all 220 pounds of him, took his place in his landing craft. Finally, the craft headed toward the shore. The seas as far as the horizon were dotted with transports. Brit belonged to the 3rd Division's 30th Infantry Regiment, whose motto was, "Our country, not ourselves." He was one of 35,000 Green American troops in Western Task Force, commanded by General George S. Patton, attacking French Morocco and Algeria. Dawn was now breaking. In the far distance, men could make out the steeple of a Catholic church rising above the Porta Fidela. There was sound of machine gun fire. Bright red tracers spat across the lightening sky. Brit heard the drone of French bombers and then saw huge fountains of spray as bombs crashed into the sea. He suddenly had a sickening feeling. The men in those bombers were trying to kill them. Brit's landing craft ground ashore. Men began to unload it, but then there was a deafening rattle of fire. Brit looked up and saw a French plane diving right towards him.
Hello, everyone. I'm Joe Craig, and welcome to today's episode of Army Matters. My guest today is Alex Kershaw, the author of the just-released book, Against All Odds, a true story of ultimate courage and survival in World War II. Millions of men in nearly 90 divisions fought in the Second World War. One of those, 3rd Infantry Division, stands apart for its heroism and its feats. The 3rd Division fought the Nazis on every European and Mediterranean front and ended with the most Medal of Honor recipients of all units. Alex's book details 4 of the unit's members: former professional football player Maurice Footsie Brit, babyface Texan Audi Murphy, West Point dropout Michael Daley, and department store manager turned officer Keith Ware. Alex is here today to talk about their individual stories, the book, and the concept of heroism. Welcome to the podcast, Alex.
It's great to be with you.
You've written a lot of books about World War II history, including The Liberator. This new one's interesting because it traces the history of the 3rd Infantry Division through the course of the war by telling the stories of 4 men that received the Medal of Honor. What was it about this unit that made you want to devote an entire book about it?
I think because they were such a great unit, and not a lot of people that really appreciate the extent to which they contributed to victory in Western Europe. I mean, they lost the most men of any U.S. division. They spent longer in combat in Europe and amazingly had by far the largest number of Medal of Honor recipients from the 3rd ID. They went from the beginning right to the end and had some amazing fighters, and I thought, hey, this is a hell of a story.
There was an interesting detail in the book that I think could surprise a lot of people, especially fans of Band of Brothers. Can you just tell us a little of the story of the Berchtesgaden?
Well, everyone thinks that the guys that won the war, the Screaming Eagles, I think they spent like maybe 120 days on the line, and the 3rd ID spent way, way longer than that. But anyway, they had 2 Medals of Honor, and the 3rd ID 36 during the war, I believe. They didn't liberate Berchtesgaden. The 3rd ID made damn sure that they got there because they'd been there at the very, very beginning, and they were utterly convinced that they, above anybody else, should be there right at the end. And they were. They were the actual American troops that actually liberated Berchtesgaden, not the Screaming Eagles.
Right.
It was theirs by right, theirs by destiny, they felt.
As you say, the division went through the entire course of the war and had so many Medal of Honor recipients. I want to talk about the 4 men that you profile in the book and just kind of introduce them to the audience. Would you start first with Maurice Footsie Britt and tell us a little bit more about him?
Yeah, he was in the 30th Infantry Regiment. He came from Arkansas and was a really, all but one guy that I write about came from very impoverished backgrounds and dealt with a hell of a lot of hardship and loss of parents, etc., early in life. So they were pretty tough by the time they got to Europe. But Footsie Britt was a star athlete at the University of Arkansas and actually played in the NFL for the Detroit Lions. So was a hell of an athlete and actually became the first U.S. soldier in World War II to earn every medal that you could win in World War II. So by that I mean the Bronze Star, Silver Star, TSC, and the Medal of Honor. So he was a hell of a guy, and unfortunately had his arm blown off at Anzio in early 1944 and could never play in the NFL again, but was just incredible. You think about that, you've got a star on the athletic field and a real-life superhero on the battlefield. So he was quite a character.
Right. And next you had 2 men who were serving in the 15th Infantry Regiment. One was quite well known, the other less so.
I chose Audi Murphy because he was in the 15th, and I wanted to sort of follow him just because I was fascinated by him, and also because I know that fans of World War II might want to hitch onto his name. And he was a kind of vehicle for taking you through the Third ID history, and also because he was in the 15th Infantry Regiment, and 3 of my 4 guys fought in that regiment. So I don't need to talk too much about Olly Murphy, born in Texas, cotton-picking country, very, very, very hard upbringing. Father abandoned the family very young, lied about his age to try and get into the U.S. military, and landed, his company commander was a guy called Keith Ware, and when they landed in Sicily, B Company on the 10th of July, 1943, and, he basically pulled them off the line because he said, I'm not going to get any kids getting killed under my command, because Murphy looked so young. Ware actually said that he looked about 13 or 14, and if you look at photographs, even when Murphy receives the Medal of Honor in June of 1945, he still looks younger than his actual age at that point, which was just, 20 years old. He had a very, very youthful, he was quite a slight character, very youthful appearance. So Maurice Britt's one guy, Olly Murphy, and then Keith Ware, who came from Colorado, and I believe is the only draftee in U.S. military history to rise to the rank of general officer. So there have been, people that joined the National Guard and others that were in the U.S. military, so to speak, before the war that reached all the way to that rank. But I believe that he was the only guy that was drafted from a pen pusher job in California, only guy that was drafted into the Second World War that ended up becoming a general officer. He was the only guy that I write about that stayed in the military and ended up commanding the Big Red One in Vietnam, and his helicopter was shot down in 1968 and he was killed. The irony of a guy that had never thought about joining the military, was drafted, was a superb officer, rose through the ranks, loved serving, and ended up receiving the Medal of Honor in World War II and then dying in Vietnam. Actually, he was killed in Cambodia. So that's the 4. That's the quadruple: Murphy, Britt, and Ware. But there's another guy we haven't talked about, Michael Daley, who we can talk about.
That's an interesting connection because he originally entered the war not with the Third ID, but with the Big Red One. So who was he and how did he make that change?
Well, he was a sort of devout Irish Catholic, and he was at West Point, and he really didn't like West Point a lot. He had issues with the sort of very strict regimentation, which you'd expect at West Point or anywhere like that. But
right.
And there were some issues, he didn't like some of the hazing. He dropped out of, decided to leave West Point and joined the first ID as a private, and he was in the 18th Infantry Regiment on Omaha Beach on June the 6th, 1944. And basically, his father was very highly decorated World War I veteran. His father was a full colonel in commanding a regiment in World War II in Europe. And so here you have father and son both serving in the European theatre, and Michael Daley was a star. I mean, you don't know how people are going to perform in combat, and proved to be an exceptional soldier, and was promoted, and then I think wounded near Aachen in fall of 1944, and then sent back to England. He recovered, and because his father was on very close terms with Alexander Patch, who was 7th Army commander, it was arranged for Michael Daley to become an aide to Patch, and he did so, and then made it pretty clear to Patch that he didn't want to be, driving generals around for the rest of the war, and asked to be sent back into the infantry, and got his wish, and ended up in the 15th Infantry Regiment with Keith Ware and Olly Murphy, and then received the Medal of Honor for actions on the 17th of April 1944 in Nuremberg, where he basically took out several machine gun nests single-handedly, led his company. He was a company commander, believe it or not, in Nuremberg, A Company of the 15th Infantry Regiment, and very badly wounded the day after he performed the actions for which he would later receive the medal. He was shot through the face and was very, very lucky to survive. He was lying in a pile of rocks and rubble in the center of Nuremberg, and unbelievably pulled that pencil out of his combat jacket and stuck it down his throat and performed a kind of basic tracheotomy on himself. And had he not been able to do that, he probably would have choked to death on his blood. He was a hell of an officer, hell of a warrior, and then went back to Connecticut and was in a sort of parade, sat beside his father in a car, returning superhero, and later said in an interview many years later, said he wished his father had received the Medal of Honor and not him. He didn't think that he'd done anything particularly special. There were a hell of a lot of guys that had served with him that had been very, very courageous.
What would you say was the common trait among the men that allowed them to perform these feats?
I'd say one of the things that all the guys I write about had in common was that they weren't obviously in combat leading others to gain medals. They were just trying to do their job, and they realized at key critical moments that they had to do it if they wanted to save lives, and they were part of that very special breed of combat soldiers then and now and throughout history that were prepared to put their lives on the line frequently so that the job got done, because otherwise a hell of a lot of guys that they were in charge of eventually would have been killed. Thankfully, we had guys like that to do it.
Yeah, they helped us win the war with that attitude. After the break, we'll continue talking with Alex about how these four men survived all sorts of obstacles.
Have you purchased your AUSA swag yet? Be proud to show your support for AUSA, which in turn shows your support for the U.S. Army and our soldiers. Check out all AUSA swag at shop.ausa.org.
We're back with author Alex Kershaw. He's the author of the book Against All Odds, a true story of ultimate courage and survival in World War II. Now, Alex, I'd like to dive deeper into the title of the book. Can you give us a sense of what the odds were actually like for a frontline soldier in World War II?
Well, I think if you found yourself in Maurice Britt's unit, the 30th Infantry Regiment, landing in November 1942 in North Africa, the odds of you being alive from his company or any other company in that regiment, it would have been a miracle. I think Audi Murphy didn't go from North Africa. He went from Sicily, and he was pulled off the line because they'd learned that he'd been recommended for the medal. And, he didn't want guys who were being put up for the Medal of Honor being killed in combat. They were much more useful as live heroes, not dead ones. The likelihood of you being killed or wounded, I mean, as an officer, you probably had, in late 1944, 45, you had probably a month or two if you're an officer. Maybe, in Normandy, 2 weeks was the sort of average, I think. Soldiers knew the best thing that you could hope for was either a very painless death or to get $1 million wound and be sent home, which meant, a serious wound. And Murphy was wounded twice. The second time badly. He had several pounds of flesh taken out of his buttock in a hospital in the south of France after he'd been hit by a sniper. The wound became gangrenous, but they put him back on the line. It's like, you can imagine, even if you had what you thought was a pretty serious wound, then you'd be back. So I just think that it was impossible to have really any kind of rational hope that you would get to the end of the war in one piece without being wounded or killed.
When you're talking about that level of attrition and turnover, accomplishments of men, especially like Ware and Murphy, when you consider that, Army psychologists are saying that basically you can't count on a soldier being combat effective after more than 200 days of action. And the length of time that some of these men served facing what they faced, it is quite astounding.
I think that report that you're referring to, I think there were some words used in that report which said that, basically no man is a Superman. Your body and your mind can only take so much. And yet we're talking about Murphy and Ware, and there were many other men in the European theatre in World War II that went for longer than 200 days in combat. They carried on, and that seems to me to be a miracle. I mean, it's, how do you explain that someone goes beyond what is supposed to be the breaking point and still functions?
The things that they were facing, as we referenced, just atrocious. And throughout the book, I mean, you have very descriptive, gripping scenes of combat throughout. And I know that you can't compare valor, but is there one or two stories that really particularly resonated with you?
I follow the four guys that we're talking about, but I also mention half a dozen at least other guys that received the Medal of Honor because they were in the same battles. A guy called Tomanak, people might recognize his name. He was on a burning tank as it rolled down a hill and carried on firing. The thing about the incidents that you come across is that they're almost unbelievable. I mean, Murphy himself stood on a burning tank for maybe an hour and just kept firing a machine gun as wave after wave of Germans approached him. He was wounded, finally got off the tank and pulled back and then regrouped part of Company B that he belonged to and then attacked the Germans again. And it's almost unrealistic when you look at what these guys did. And I think they were just so in the moment that their adrenaline, their determination, they were in supreme action. And it's almost as if you're talking about supreme athletes. It's almost like watching superb Lionel Messi score a goal or, Michael Jordan. That level of performance that it sort of seems otherworldly, it really is. Certainly to me, as someone that's never been near a war, I just can't imagine the physical, mental, and emotional, psychological strain of doing what these guys did. And so, superhuman almost.
Just to wrap us up, I'm wondering if you could talk about, the costs and how Footsie, Britt, Audi Murphy, Ware, and Daley, how did they adjust to post-war life?
What really impressed me was that even though they did, in Murphy's case, suffer a lot from what was then called battle fatigue, and in Michael Daley's case, he liked to have a good drink for several years after the war and felt a little bit quite directionless and had a hard time readjusting in some ways to peace. All the four guys I write about had eventually very productive lives, even though Murphy, died early in a plane crash. I think he was 46 years old. And yet these guys, you'd imagine that they would have just gone home and drank themselves to death and been a complete wrecks, but they were made of there was something inside them that was very strong, and they came back, and even though they'd been through hell, they contributed. They had families and, very productive lives. They gave a lot back to the US and their communities, and Maurice Britt became Lieutenant Governor of Arkansas. Michael Daley was very active in his community and very active with helping support veterans at the end of their life, etc. What impressed me most was just how much they were able to give after the war, having already given everything they possibly could during it. It was just as awe-inspiring to see how well they behaved and how productive they were. They battled through and made the most of their lives, which is what I found ultimately most inspiring.
Yeah, well, you certainly have written a very inspiring book here, and it's a great testament to these men's service, both in the war and back in the civilian world. So I want to thank you for writing the book, and I want to thank you for being our guest here today.
Thank you so much.
And listeners, I want to remind you that Alex Kershaw's new book is Against All Odds, a true story of ultimate courage and survival in World War II. So thanks again, Alex.
Thanks a lot.
We've been chatting with Alex Kershaw, whose new book, Against All Odds, is now available in bookstores and online. I'm Joe Craig, and thanks for listening.
To all our listeners, thanks for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to the Army Matters podcast on iTunes and everywhere podcasts are found. The Army Matters podcast series is brought to you by the Association of the United States Army, the U.S. Army's professional association, member-supported, Army-connected. Visit us at AUSA.org for more information or to become a member. Your membership helps AUSA continue to carry out its mission to educate, inform, and connect with the total Army, our industry partners, and our supporters of a strong national defense. For questions or to provide topic recommendations, email us at podcast@ausa.org. Have a great Army Day. Hua.